So in Pride and Prejudice, Lydia is ruined for forever if Wickham doesn't marry her. But exactly why? Why is Lydia ruined? And why is there such a big double standard between what happens to men and what happens to women in these elopement situations? Well, that is what we're diving into here in today's video, all about the Regency era double standard and what was behind it. If you want to learn all about that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So of course, in the story of Pride and Prejudice, we have Lydia and Wickham run off together in an elopement where she thinks he's going to marry her and he is not planning on marrying her at all. In the Regency era, they would have looked at this as a seduction. Now, of course, seduction was where a man slept with a woman who was unmarried. Adultery was if she was married. But either way, these were both highly looked down upon in the Regency era and would have completely ruined a woman, not just her reputation, but her entire life. We see Mary Bennet sum this up nicely for us when she moralizes over her sister's drama. Here she says, "Unhappy as the event must be for Lydia, we may draw from it this useful lesson, that loss of virtue in a female is irretrievable, that one false step involves her in endless ruin, that her reputation is no less brittle than it is beautiful, and that she cannot be too guarded in her behavior towards the undeserving of the other sex." So here we have Mary sum up about how a woman taking one false step can involve her in endless ruin. And this endless ruin literally never ended for the rest of her life unless she could get the guy who had seduced her to marry her. Because this would have sort of legitimatized it, as we see happen within Pride and Prejudice. However, if Wickham had not married Lydia, she would have been involved in endless ruin. Now, of course, the question then comes up, as we've talked about in past videos, like on What is a Regency Era Rake, about how guys could get away with going around seducing women, more or less, that there's this major, massive double standard happening that completely ruins a woman for this type of behavior on one hand, and sort of, it's kind of like, okay, that wasn't the best thing you could have done, guy, but like, we'll forgive you. On the other hand, what is causing this? Now, of course, if we look at this double standard on the surface, it might seem pretty clear-cut. I feel like a lot of watchers of Jane Austen movies and readers of her books get the basic idea that a woman is expected to be pure, chaste, and only ever sleep with her husband, or she will be ruined. And a lot of people think this goes back to the Christian religious beliefs that were very, very popular in the Regency era, and by popular, I mean that was their world. As we talked about in the recent video on gender roles, women in this time period's entire lives were drenched in Christianity. However, those beliefs only account for part of this equation because, of course, on the surface, even religious teachers at the time were saying that men should hypothetically be just as chaste and pure as women are. There is no men can sleep around as much as they want, asterisk in the Christian scriptures. However, there definitely was within the Regency era, even though on the surface it was condemned. Why? Why were women held up to the religious ideal while men were not? Well, that is a great question, but before we dive into it, let's talk about another Georgian love affair. Their love affair with shopping for Rayo's amazing seasonal deals. Thank you so much to Ferreo for being the partner on this video. So you guys know I've been loving the FAQ 202 by Ferreo for a while now. It is a FDA cleared new generation LED silicone face mask that has 8 different wavelengths of light that help me address all my different skin concerns, because I have both anti-aging skin concerns about like wrinkles and fine lines and sunspots and stuff, and also still acne and super sensitivity skin concerns like redness and pimples and the such, guys. Why do I have them all at once? I don't know, but what I do know is that the FAQ 202 helps me address them. I love doing a treatment and just taking a little bit of time out for me. I've been really working on my goals for next year and like journaling all of that out. But also the treatments help me feel like I'm investing in future me and shaping the way I age, while also seeing more immediate results with more supple and smooth skin, and also just this inner radiance that helps me feel more confident in my everyday life. So it's both short-term payoffs and long-term investment with my skincare here. And right now, Foreo's having amazing seasonal deals, perfect for buying gifts for someone you love or even yourself. So definitely click the link in the description below and use my code WOOD35 for an additional 35% off almost all Foreo products. And this code is stackable, so you can use it on products that are already on sale. So definitely click the link, use my code, and shop Foreo today. Now, back to the video. Of course, one of these reasons was that they thought that men and women were inherently different when it came to morality. Women were just better, more angelic, more pure creatures than men were, and this was part of a woman's job, was to help men become better men because they were the like sort of moral guide that he can turn to, and she just has like such a great influence on him. Now, of course, while this role of being the angel in the house definitely had some positive benefits for women of the time period, it gave them a voice in issues that were moral. It did give them some influence within the family because men were looking to them as their moral guides and better halves. At the same time, it also gave them greater limitations and higher expectations because basically it was like, no, wife, you are supposed to be the moral one. I am the one you're making better, but also, I don't have to be that moral. I can have affairs sometimes. I don't have to live up to our religious ideals as much as you do because it's easier for you because you're just inherently more pure than I am. You see where this is going here? However, another major issue underlying this double standard was the idea of women as sexual property. Now, of course, no one in the Regency era would have come out and said that as a sentence, like women are sexual property. However, that was how the overall system was set up to run and how people viewed it. Of course, if women are sexual property, the question then comes up, who owns them? Well, of course, after marriage, it was their husbands, and one of the reasons they needed to be so chaste was so that their husband could have complete and total ownership of that sexual property, as we see one kind of touch on. Nothing makes women more esteemed by the opposite sex than chastity. Whether it be that we always prize those most who are hardest to come at, or that nothing besides chastity, with its collateral attendants, truth, fidelity, and constancy, gives the man a property in the person he loves, and consequently endears her to him above all things. So as we see in this quote, a woman's chastity is what gives her husband a property in her affections. Basically, does he really own anything if she can be out there spreading her affections all over the place? No, they need to belong to only him. However, what is very fascinating is this idea that a man owns a wife's affections was quite literally illegal. So if you've seen my video about Regency era divorce, then you're familiar with criminal conversation cases, which is basically where if a man seduced another man's wife, the husband could sue him. Of course, we see an example of this in Mansfield Park, where Henry Crawford seduces Mrs. Rushworth. So Mr. Rushworth can sue Henry Crawford for financial damages. And the financial damages were because he stole his wife's affection and company from him that legally belonged to only him as a husband. So the question, of course, then comes up, could a wife do the same thing? If a wife's affections are considered a property that belongs to her husband, so much so that he can actually sue any man who has share in her affections besides him for stealing them, can a wife do the same thing and sue the other woman if her husband has an affair? I'm sure many of you guys have guessed the answer to this, and it is no. Because while a husband owned the affections of his wife, a wife did not own the affections of her husband. Why? Well, it really goes back to what we were talking about recently in a video on gender roles about how men were considered inherently superior to women. And so in a marriage relationship, the husband was the superior, he was the head, and he was also the only legal entity within the marriage. So on one hand, a wife could not sue the other woman because she has no legal entity. Her husband has to sue anyone for her. Her husband would have to sue the other woman for sleeping with him because she has no legal right to. So, I mean, there's like that technicality, but that's not even the biggest technicality here. The bigger issue and technicality of why she can't sue the other woman is because she doesn't own her husband's affections to begin with and thereby has had no loss. As we see William Blackstone, a famous legal commentator, note about the power dynamics. The inferior hath no kind of property in the company, care, or assistance of the superior, as the superior is held to have in those of the inferior. And therefore, the inferior can suffer no loss or injury. So here we see him talking about how in a relationship where there's a superior and an inferior, the inferior has no rights to the superior. So this goes right along with other relationships like this. So for example, an employer could technically sue someone for stealing their servant because they have rights to that servant by contract. Right? They're like, I have signed a year contract with this servant to be my servant, and you stole them away. Thereby, I had a loss, and I can sue you. However, if someone kidnapped the employer, so for example, say someone kidnapped Mr. Darcy, his servants could not sue over that because they're the inferiors, right? Like they have no right to him the way he has a right to them. Anyway, it's the same thing in this marriage relationship where basically the husband has a right to the wife. The wife does not have a right to her husband, and therefore she can experience no loss or injury. So legally, if he's having an affair on her, she has not lost anything because she never really had it or owned it to begin with. Now let's get into the life of single women. So if you are a Jane Austen heroine, you're young, you're not married yet, you do not have a husband claiming the legal rights over your affections. Are your affections just free? Can you go around spreading them as much as you want? The answer is, of course, no. But why? Exactly why does a woman not own her own virtue, even in her singleness? This was a question that even those in the Regency era really struggled to answer, because when it came to a woman being virtuous to her husband, it was like, well, he owns her affections, he has the right to fully believe that any child she bears him is his, and is not a spurious offspring of someone else that's going to inherit his estate and, derail the entire entail thing. But when it came to women in their youth before marriage, one of the major answers they came up with was if a young woman slept around before marriage, then she would get used to it and sleep around after marriage. As one reference work put it, nothing contributes so much to preserve the fidelity of wives to their husbands as the impressing upon the minds of women the highest veneration for the virtue of chastity. She who, when unmarried, has been accustomed to grant favors to different men, will not find it easy, if indeed possible, to resist afterwards the allurements of variety. So there we have Regency era men just scared that their future wives will get used to the allurements of variety. We see, too, another interesting aspect of this. From a certain perspective, a young woman's virtue was under the guardianship of her father in her youth. Now, of course, we hear a lot about a father's protection, even a brother's protection. Now, of course, this protection was complex and a broader thing. However, one of the things that they held in their protection was their daughter's or sister's virtue, and keeping that absolutely pure up until it is turned over to her husband. Now, a father was so much involved in the protection of his daughter's virtue that he could also sue if she was seduced. So a father is the one who could bring a seduction case against a seducer. Hypothetically, Mr. Bennet, if Wickham had refused to marry Lydia, could have sued him for the financial damages over the elopement with Lydia. For the relationship between father and daughter was one of those superior to inferior relationships where the father owned some of the property, more or less, in his daughter that has now been stolen by the seducer. Now, what's really interesting is, of course, the father would be suing for damages done to him as the father. These suits were not out there just being like, you hurt my daughter, I'm mad at you, though I'm sure many fathers had like that sort of feeling too while suing the seducers. But also what the courts were awarding on was the issues that were brought on to the father and the rest of the family. As law journals note, fathers were allowed exemplary damages, so-called, for disturbance of peace of mind, loss of social position, and the like. The jury may award a compensation for the dishonor and disgrace cast upon the plaintiff and his family by such an injury. So, of course, we know that by seducing Lydia, Wickham has brought dishonor on the entire Bennet family and jeopardized all of Lydia's sister's future marriages as well. And Mr. Bennet could get money from that. That is, of course, if Mr. Wickham had any money to actually sue him for. Hypothetically, however, if a father did sue over the seduction of his daughter, how much would he get? How much would he be awarded by the jury? Well, it really depended on who he was. As Blackstone put it, the damages are estimated from the rank and situation of the parent, or from the degree of affliction which, under all these circumstances, he may be supposed to suffer. So here we see two different considerations. One, the situation, circumstances under which he suffers. So for example, if a seducer got the guy's daughter pregnant, that was a complicating factor there. However, we also see that is based on the rank and situation of the father. And this, of course, creates a very interesting dynamic. So, if we look at Pride and Prejudice, there is Wickham, being a terrible guy, just really getting around town, as we learn in this passage. All Meryton seemed striving to blacken the man who, but 3 months before, had been almost an angel of light. He was declared to be in debt to every tradesman in the place, and his intrigues, all honored with the title of seduction, had been extended into every tradesman family. Everybody declared that he was the wickedest young man in the world. So, of course, here Jane Austen is saying that maybe not every intrigue Wickham had actually ended in seduction, and there might be a little bit overblowing of this gossip here. However, the chances that Wickham has not seduced at least one person during his stay in Meryton is probably unlikely. But if he did seduce a tradesman's daughter, that tradesman, being a lower position and probably income bracket than Mr. Bennet, would get less damages than Mr. Bennet would over the seduction of Lydia. And this, of course, creates an interesting situation where the virtue of a daughter of a higher social position is worth more financially than the virtue of a daughter from a lower social position. Which takes us to this point, determining a woman's worth. So as we have talked about, if women are being viewed as sexual property, then like any other sort of property, they have higher or lower worths. Like if this was money, there would be different prices on them, as we see in these seduction cases where literally Lydia's virtue is worth more than the daughter of a tradesman's virtue. Now, of course, two major factors that affected the worth or value of a particular woman's virtue was its purity and it's class. So let's talk about class first. Like we've been noticing here, if Lydia's virtue is worth more than a tradesman's daughter's virtue, basically we see the situation where women from a higher class were worth more and should be thereby more guarded than women from a lower class. A woman's sexual property value is directly tied into her overall social value. But this is something that we see continue throughout the 19th century, and one writer noted this about the topic. While many conduct books and popular medical writers imagined young ladies to be so modest that the use of a stethoscope could be perceived as a violation, working-class women's bodies were seen as places of public access, open not only to sexual advances by men, but, for instances, under the Contagious Disease Acts of the 1860s, to inspections. So here we really see society viewing women and their bodies and their sexuality very different depending on what level of society they come from. And this is something we see reflected in Pride and Prejudice itself. So of course, when Lizzie is at Rosings and she breaks it to Lady Catherine that she is leaving, Lady Catherine decides to try to micromanage their entire journey back home. And she says this: "Mrs. Collins, you must send a servant with them. You know I always speak my mind, and I cannot bear the idea of two young women travelling post by themselves. It is highly improper. You must contrive to send somebody. I have the greatest dislike in the world to that sort of thing. Young women should always be properly guarded and attended according to their situation in life. When my niece Georgiana went to Ramsgate last summer, I made a point of her having 2 men servants go with her. Miss Darcy, the daughter of Mr. Darcy of Pemberley, and Lady Anne could not have appeared with propriety in a different manner. I'm excessively attentive to all those things. You must send John with the young ladies, Mrs. Collins. I am glad it occurred to me to mention it, for it would really be discreditable to you to let them go alone." So here we see Lady Catherine saying that young women and their virtue need to be guarded according to their situation in life. And we see a couple of different situations in life happening in the story. She thinks that Elizabeth Bennet and Maria Lucas need to be accompanied by 1 male servant in order to guard them. They're 1-servant kind of girls. However, her niece, Miss Darcy, Georgiana, the daughter of late Mr. Darcy of Pemberley and Lady Anne Darcy, she deserves 2 servants. She, at her higher position in life, needs to be more guarded. So here is the question, guys. Are you a 1-servant or 2-servant kind of girl? I don't know. Maybe I need like 5 servants. Of course, there's definitely some irony in this, because even though Miss Darcy had 2 male servants with her to protect and guard her, she still almost got totally scammed by Wickham and eloped with him, which, if you have not seen my video on the Georgiana Wickham backstory, I highly recommend it, even though I made it myself. But it was just really fun to make, guys. So that is the first factor that determines a woman's property value pretty much from the moment of birth. Again, there we see Lady Catherine referencing who Georgiana's parents are, because like we learned about in the social class video, a woman's social class was largely determined by the men in her life. First her father, potentially her brothers, and then her husband. And so because she was born into that level of family, that is what makes her a 2-servant, classy kind of gal. But let us move on to the second point, which is, of course, purity. So if a woman is already born with her social class worth, what happens after birth is where purity comes in, which is, of course, where she needs to never sleep with a man who is not her husband. In fact, she can't even hint that direction. She can't even give the impression that she is slightly open to such advances. This is so incredibly vital. How vital? Well, one Regency reference work put it this way. It is therefore a wise institution, and agreeable to the will of him who made us, to train up women so as that they may look upon the loss of their chastity as the most disgraceful of all crimes, as that which sinks them in the order of society and robs them of all their value. So here we see how a woman's very value as a human being is connected to her chastity in the time period. If she loses her chastity, then she loses her value as a human. And I think it's sometimes very hard for modern readers to understand how profound and dramatic this was in the time period. It really did ruin the rest of a woman's life unless she could get her seducer to marry her. But basically, when they say that a young lady is ruined, it literally means ruined. Like, I don't know how else to put this. Because again, if we go back to this idea that women are property, their property value plummets to zero with the loss of their chastity. Of course, girls in this time period were raised with this in mind to absolutely protect their purity. And one of the things that really contributed to this is modesty. Like we talk about in a recent video on Mary Bennet and the piano, modesty was a corner foundation stone of female purity. So this modesty, where they were so blushing, even if someone just looked at them, was supposed to protect them from going any steps further, right? Like if a girl can't even handle it, if a guy looks at her, how is she going to be over there like getting seduced by him? Right? She's not. And that was one of the ideas there about with Mary Bennet and the piano. Wanting to be looked at like that was seen as a step towards wanting to sleep with somebody. As one author put it, many women have lost their characters through indiscretion only. With respect to the world, it is as bad to appear wicked as to be really so. She who throws off her modesty, either in her words or her dress, will not be thought to set much value upon it in her actions. So basically, if you speak immodestly, if your dress is immodest, then people are like, I bet you're doing other immodest things, and we're going to make you lose your character over it. So like we talked about in the other video, this would really include women wanting to shun the public eye, not be sort of like super seen and noticed. No woman would want to be described as being super forward and bold, meaning they're like putting themselves out there. And this is something we even see in Jane Austen's letters. So Jane Austen is in town and she's going to different art exhibitions and she's looking for portraits that remind her of the characters that she's written, right? And she pretty quickly finds one of Jane Bennet, but she is struggling to find one that looks like Elizabeth Bennet until she finally comes to this conclusion. Monday evening, we have been both to the exhibition and Sir J. Reynolds, and I am disappointed, for there was nothing like Mrs. D at either. I can only imagine that Mr. D prizes any picture of her too much to like it should be exposed to the public eye. I can imagine he would have that sort of feeling. That mixture of love, pride, and delicacy. So there we have Mr. Darcy. He just has too much of a mixture of love, pride, and delicacy to want anyone to look at a portrait of his wife. Right? He does not want her exposed to the public eye. Only he and like his family who come to Pemberley and stuff can gaze upon her. But of course, the way Jane Austen is referring to this behavior is almost as if it's somewhat common, and it's not the only instance of a husband wanting to hide the portrait of his wife more or less away from the public in history and literature. Basically, what we're seeing here is men even wanting their wives to be so modest in representation, right? Like she's not out there for everyone. Because next thing you know, if someone's looking at her portrait, could they be sleeping with his wife too? I don't know. You never know. Things escalate quickly. But basically, when it comes to this purity aspect, a woman was not only expected to actually be pure, but also give the impression of being pure and not letting anything even remotely that could suggest that she is okay with anyone making advances to her, anywhere near her. As one author put it, there is an innate dignity and ingenuous modesty peculiar to your sex, which naturally protects you from the freedom of ours. This sense of virtue should be felt by every woman, prior to the reflection that it is her interest to keep herself sacred from familiarities with the men. So there's a woman's modesty, keeping her sacred from familiarities with the men. So if we put all of this together, we basically see women being valued for their chastity because it is a property that belongs to their future or current husband. Now, of course, it's interesting because a young woman, such as the heroines of Jane Austen novels, their main goal is, of course, to maintain their value until their marriage. And then once they are married, it belongs to their husband. However, if their husband dies and they become a widow, there was a devaluing there because they had already been with one man. Now, of course, widows could and did get remarried. They were respectable within society. However, there was a general prejudice against them by some men because of this entire thing. Which just takes us all back to the issue of Lydia Bennet. And why is Lydia Bennet ruined? Well, as we can see, Lydia started off pretty good. She's the daughter of a gentleman. Her virtue via class is already up, being worth the protection of one servant and more money if her father sues anyone who seduces her. So she's starting off strong. But of course, as we talk about in a recent video, there is sort of a lack of both protection from parents and instilling of this ultimate, you need to be modest. Don't even let people look at you. If you have a painting, hide it in your house. She's sort of missing that, and instead she's running around wildly flirting. So in many ways, Lydia is very close to being ruined the entire book. Her reputation and her character is already falling to shreds in front of her entire family. But then when she elopes with Wickham, in Regency eyes, her property value drops to 0. And she is officially ruined. However, the only thing that can save her at that point is Wickham marrying her. And that is one of the reasons Darcy steps in and makes that marriage happen. Because basically, society kind of had this loophole of if you can get your seducer to marry you, or usually her family would be a lot behind this too. If you can get the seducer of your daughter to marry her, then we'll kind of overlook it. And we see towards the end of the book, Jane Austen note that this was the outcome. It says, in spite of her youth and her manners, she retained all the claims to reputation which her marriage had given her. So basically, Lydia was ruined just during that time period when she was eloping with Wickham before Darcy brought about this marriage and made it all legitimatized. However, if we really want to drill down to the most basic issue underlying Lydia being ruined or any young woman in this time period being ruined, it's because they were born into a society that tied their value as a human being into their sexual purity. And yeah, that's the basics of it. So let me know in the comments down below. If you lived in the Regency era, how many servants would it require to guard you? I am still sticking with 5, even though I don't even know what social level that would put me at. Maybe I'd have to be the crown princess or something. Maybe should I cut back to 3? Could I be a duke's daughter with 3? I don't know. Also, while we're here, special shout out to my channel members. Hi! There are so many of you, so many. Thank you for being part of our awesome community. And as always, guys, keep being awesome because you're awesome. Bye.